Hello and welcome to Otago University Vote Chat. Vote Chat is a series of conversations with politicians and commentators in election year looking at various election issues. We're doing this from the Otago University Media Production Studio with a live audience here with us, and we're live streaming it out on the internet. So welcome if you're watching this on the New Zealand Herald website or on the University of Otago website. We're also doing this on Twitter. We're being a bit interactive. We've got someone live tweeting the discussion as we go. Liam.
Cheers, Bryce, and welcome to those already following us on Twitter. For those who don't know how this works, I'm going to be live tweeting all the good yarns here today between Max and Bryce. So if you've got any pressing comments, questions, reactions, feel free to use our Twitter handle, OUVoteChat, or the hashtag VoteChat14. Later on in the show, I'll be sharing some of those thoughts and questions with Max.
Okay, so for this first Vote Chat, we're looking at the issue of inequality. So recently the US President Obama said that inequality is the defining issue of our times, and Pope Francis has said some similar things, so it really is taking off around the world. Here in New Zealand we haven't really focused on inequality as an election issue for, well, a long time, but it seems to be coming back this year. It seems to be, with our focus on the economy in this election year, it seems to be one of the major features. So we're going to talk about that today, how it might affect how people vote, how the election campaign goes. And so we've got today journalist and author Max Rashbrooke. He is really the current expert in New Zealand about inequality, and last year he put out this book, he edited this book, Inequality, a New Zealand Crisis, and more recently the shorter version, The Inequality Debate. So welcome, Max.
Thanks, Bryce, great to be here.
Okay, well, let's hit you with the big question right away. You're the expert on inequality, you're really concerned with inequality, so how are you going to vote this year?
Well, you know, I'm a journalist, basically,
yeah.
Bryce, and so
journalists are allowed to vote.
Journalists
sure.
are allowed to vote, although you'll know that Colin James doesn't vote
some don't.
At all, hasn't voted for a long time. I do vote, but I also, particularly because I'm dealing with quite a political subject in what I write about, I have to be careful not to appear to be, advocating for any particular party. So I'm going to duck that one, I'm afraid. That's between me and the ballot box.
That's fair enough. That's your right. But surely some parties are going to be better than others in terms of outcomes relating to inequality?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And you can get a bit of a guide from past history. I mean, the Greens, for example, at the last election explicitly had a package aimed at inequality, which the other parties didn't. Already you can see Labour raising it much more as an issue. I don't think we quite know where National are going to be on that. That's probably one of the big questions for the next 6 months.
Well, let's start with National being the biggest party of the moment and in government. How have they impacted on inequality over the last 5 years since they've been in government?
Well, that's a really interesting issue, and you might have already seen John Key and David Cunliffe go head to head over that. Is inequality increasing or not? And what the figures show us is that inequality has been fluctuating up and down, but it's actually been quite static since the global financial crisis. Now, people might say, how on earth can that be the case? Because everybody knows how tough it is at the bottom. But what happens after a big financial crisis is that you get a temporary hit to incomes at the top as well. So the share market's not doing as well, dividends are lower, corporate profits are lower. So
from your point of view, that'd be a good thing. That brings down inequality, is that right?
Well, you only want to bring down inequality at the top if it's unjustified. That's the main thing.
Surely you think it's unjustified?
Oh yeah, absolutely. An element of it is, but you'd rather want to do that in a planned way than just leaving it up to chance and whatever financial crises do. But so that's that's what's happened in the last few years, say up to 2012. You've had income falls kind of across the board, so inequality's been quite flat. But what I think we've seen since say 2012 up until now is probably a recovery in incomes at the top that hasn't been picked up yet in the data. So I think there's good reason to say that actually probably inequality is on the increase again.
But nonetheless, National's been in power during these really difficult economic times, global financial crisis, basically the biggest economic global disaster since the 30s, yet inequality hasn't increased. They haven't gone for major austerity measures. They haven't really cut benefits like in the 1990s. They haven't, really hammered the trade unions. So inequality has been surprisingly, well, it's fared quite well, hasn't it, under National?
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, you could probably debate that last point about the trade unions, because actually one of the most significant changes that National is making is weakening the power to bargain collectively. And, it's accepted internationally that collective bargaining is one of the strongest ways of pushing up wages at the bottom and reducing inequality. Okay. So that will have an effect, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, like I said, broadly speaking, inequality is flat.
Okay.
But, you would have seen like a month or so ago, the Treasury came out and said, we got some of the figures wrong.
Yeah.
Actually, there are a lot more children in poverty than we thought. And that changes the story a bit, because we had thought that, the poorest families had been protected, had been insulated a bit from the recession. And actually, we now know that the child poverty rate has jumped from 22% to 27%.
Right.
So there has been some real hardship at that bottom end.
So we'll come back to that in a moment. We'll try and make this interactive, do this over Twitter. So we'll just go to Liam and see if there's any response or questions on Twitter.
Yeah, so far it's been really interesting, Bryce. Max, there's been one question which has come through on the topic of political parties in New Zealand. You sort of dance around the question of who you might vote for and what you're going to do in that regard. But John Brinsley Perry's actually asked, in response to the issue of inequality, what party do you think tackles the issue the best right now?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, and again, as a journalist, I can't really come out and endorse any particular party. I would just say, we don't know for a start. There's 6 months to go until the election, right? We haven't had the full slate of policy by any means. The early indications are, like I said, that the parties, say broadly on the left and centre left, have got more of a hold on the issue so far. But there's a long time to go, and we'll just have to see how that pans out.
Okay. So on the question of the current government then, so you think that the next indicators to come out might show a worsening position for inequality. But what about some of the policies that National are pushing at the moment? Like, the major one this year so far is John Key's State of the Nation speech about education. Surely, which I think is a pitch to the issue of inequality. They're saying they're going to put lots more money into schools, they're going to set up a more collaborative model between secondary schools, using principals going into lower decile schools. And, I guess the argument is that National's going to help inequality by ameliorating the bad performance of schools. Isn't that quite a strong sort of inequality policy?
Yeah, I think it is, although it depends what exactly you mean by inequality. And I think one of the big debates that we're going to see over the next 6 months, and you see this in other countries, is the debate between people who say inequality itself is the problem. We have to narrow the income gap. There's people who say, actually, that's a sideshow. What we need to do is focus on social mobility.
Yeah.
And the chance for people to move up and down that ladder, no matter how big the gaps are.
That's a really good argument, isn't it? That social mobility is more important than inequality?
No, because, social mobility is important. You want to be able to have a society where how well people do isn't influenced too much by how their parents have done. But the two things are really linked.
Well, they are, but isn't the point that, people in different stages of their life have different sort of levels of income, and if you've got social mobility, everyone's got the chance to sort of rise up, and that, we might be poor when we're at university as students or whatever, but eventually through mobility, and New Zealand arguably has high social mobility, it all works out in the end.
Yeah, the thing though is that there's a lot of evidence that there are problems that are caused specifically by income inequality, no matter how good your social mobility is. Societies that have got high levels of income inequality have high rates of health and social problems, they suffer from poor social cohesion, their politics is very influenced by the top 1%, and they actually tend to have lower economic growth as well. So there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about income inequality all by itself. Secondly, that argument that mobility is all right, poverty doesn't matter as long as people can move out of it. Well, that's not true, because when you look at the evidence we have from those surveys that follow people from birth, right through their life, the kids who are born into poverty do worse than the kids who are born into wealth, even if those kids later become wealthy. So early poverty leaves a mark on people that social mobility can never erase.
Right.
And that's an argument about ensuring people are never poor, not that they can, lift themselves out of poverty at some future
So
point.
you're saying that even in a society that has bad inequality, even if social mobility is great, it's still not a good situation?
No, I mean, and child poverty imposes huge costs on us as a country. And income inequality creates a lot of issues at the top as well. I mean, you look at the income that accumulates in the top 1% and therefore their ability to buy undeserved advantages or to influence politics. And again, that's an issue about the income gaps between people. And if I can just say one other thing, this whole debate, income inequality, social mobility, they're actually really closely linked, because all the evidence is that in a more equal society, you have better mobility.
Right.
So like you think about America, right? The home of free market capitalism, supposedly great social mobility. Actually, if you're born into the bottom fifth of kids there, only 8% of those kids ever make it into the top fifth. Just 8%. Whereas in a much more equal country like Denmark, over 20% of those kids make it to the top.
Now it sounds like there's a question on Twitter about relating to this for you, Max.
There is a question from Mark Maguire, and he's saying that he's heard that incomes have risen in New Zealand since the global financial crisis. Are poorer and middle income families really better off?
The short answer to that is no, not really. With the latest revision, the discovery about the mistake that the Treasury made with the figures, actually most low-income families are slightly worse off than they were before the crisis. Bryce's point is right. They haven't seen huge falls in their income. We haven't seen, massive cuts to benefits or anything like that. But no, those families are doing it tough.
Okay, just going back to National then. So if National are re-elected, and the polls are looking pretty good for them at the moment, what do you think, what's your projections for what would happen with inequality?
Well, I suspect we would see it continuing to rise.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right, the National are doing things, particularly on social mobility, and that schools package is, that's a big investment. That's over $300 million, right? And that will absolutely have an effect on increasing the life chances of kids in the long run. But, that education stuff takes a long time to feed through.
Right.
And, what drives income inequality in the short term is much more stuff about, people's bargaining power, are their wages keeping up with inflation, taxes and benefits. And the tax cuts we've had in the last few years, the benefit of that has gone predominantly to people in the top 10%.
So what about the GST changes? Has that impacted on inequality?
Yeah, it does, because, obviously GST is a flat rate, but it hits hardest on people on low incomes. You might think that we have a really progressive income tax structure in this country, and in theory we do, but actually people on low incomes pay 30% of their income in GST and income tax, because GST hits them so hard. So yeah, that has a really regressive effect.
Okay, so would that be one area that you would advocate a change?
Well, that's a tricky one. In terms of what's on the table at the moment, nobody's talking about a reduction in GST really seriously. Labor did have a policy of taking it off fruit and veg, but they've abandoned even that.
Right.
So,
well, what do you think about that? Let's talk about Labor then. What do you think about their reversal on that issue in terms of inequality?
I think that is probably justified. I think it's complex to administer that kind of thing,
right.
And actually I think the evidence was that the benefits of that would not go disproportionately to people at the bottom. In contrast, they've also stepped away from having the first $5,000 of income.
So at the last
tax-free.
election, the first $5,000 that you earned would be tax-free.
Yeah.
That would give $10 a week or something, better incomes to probably everyone.
Yeah.
So you thought that was good policy?
Yeah, it depends about how you do it. But if you say have the first $5,000 or the first $10,000 tax-free, that obviously provides a boost to everybody's incomes, but
including the rich. Yeah.
Including the rich, but it makes a bigger difference, obviously. $10 or $20 a week makes a big difference at the bottom.
Yeah.
Also, you can do that sort of thing where you actually claw that back higher up the tax scale. So you say to people who are earning $30,000, your first $10,000 is free, but if you're earning over $100,000, well, you don't get that allowance free at the bottom. So you're not giving it to people at the top,
right.
And then it's even more progressive.
Okay. So what else are Labor doing? They've got the baby bonus. What's your feeling about that in terms of inequality, what that would mean for inequality?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I think the evidence would show you as part of the picture. I mean, they're talking about a universal payment in the first year of every kid's life and then having it means tested subsequently.
Right.
And, you know, there's a lot of international evidence that, I mean, it's funny, you might think that for tackling inequality and poverty, you want to do targeted stuff, but actually the countries that have the lowest rates of poverty and the lowest rates of inequality are the ones that do a lot of universal stuff.
Okay, well, so in terms of that baby bonus then, which is quite targeted for those second and third years, is that a mistake on Labor's part?
No, I think that's just them working within the fiscal constraints that they've got. I mean, it's all the evidence is the first year of life is the one that matters the most. That's where you really get the big return on your investment. I mean, ideally, maybe you might want it universal up to age 3, but we don't have the levels of tax that those countries that do universalism have as well.
But it's just really curious that, you know, Labor had that policy of just about universal for that first year. Do you think they just may as well make it all universal? And I mean, what's better?
Well, I don't know. That's a really tricky question. And you have, you know, obviously, particularly if you're looking to be in government, you have to do stuff that you think is affordable. And Labor have clearly got other stuff in the pipeline that they think is going to chew up some of the money that they would have spent on that.
Right.
So they're making that calculation.
And do you think the public's... How much is that resonating with the public, things like the baby bonus, in terms of inequality, do you think?
I think people respond to it positively. And, you know, to be frank, people don't necessarily pick up the finer point of, you know, at what point exactly does it become means tested and all the rest of it.
Okay. So, I mean, in terms of polling, is there a question on Twitter?
Yeah, there is actually, and it's really good that you brought up that point about people responding positively to Labor's baby bonus. If the national government is likely to increase inequality, and you look at it right now, the polls are saying, you know, they're fairly well placed to take a third term. Why is Labor doing so badly?
Wow, big question.
Yeah, good question. Well, I'm not sure that the fact that Labor is doing badly is particularly related to inequality. I mean, there's a lot of things that are in play in the election, and there's a lot of things that matter to how parties poll. I mean, and their perception of parties' competence and all the rest of it. You know, and stories about David Cunliffe's trusts and everything else. I mean, that's probably having more of an impact at the moment. I mean, I think where, you know, Labor's sort of the opportunity and what will determine how successful they are is, I mean, you can see the narrative that they're telling already. It's about there's a recovering economy, but people aren't getting a share of that.
Yeah.
So I think their success on that issue will depend to what extent people think that that's true and what extent they reject
What do you
that.
think? Do you think it is going to resonate during the next 5 or 6 months? I mean, because that's what Labor's hoping, aren't they? As energy bills go up, as maybe interest rates go up for mortgage holders, are those inequality messages going to start, you know, being fruitful for Labor, do you think?
I think there's a good chance that they will. I mean, you know, if I absolutely knew that, then I'd probably be a highly paid consultant and not a poorly paid journalist. But that aside, I think what you can see from the polling evidence is that inequality is already a big concern, and it's massively increased since, say, you know, 2010.
Yeah.
And what I think is happening there is that immediately after something like a big financial crisis, people aren't that bothered about inequality because they're just surviving.
Okay.
You know, they're just hunkering down, they're just trying to get by. They're not too worried about what's happening with other people. But once things start to recover, and there is income around, there is income being generated, suddenly people want to know, well, am I getting a share of it?
That's a really interesting point, because I mean, if you look at the history of you know, even social unrest or revolutions or whatever, they don't tend to happen when things are getting worse for the population. It's when things start to improve from a low base, they start to question whether things are being equally shared, etc. So I think you're right in that. So you're saying that counterintuitively, if the economy improves quite well in the next 6 months, that's the most likelihood for Labor to be able to, you know, get somewhere with that message about inequality. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and there's, you know, and there's some evidence to back that up. I mean, just the latest figures show that, you know, since the recession, productivity has increased a lot. You know, people are working harder and smarter, they're generating more value, but people's average wages have not increased anywhere near as quickly as productivity. So, you know, there is that gap between the effort that people are putting in and the reward that they're getting out of it.
But only if they are aware of that that gap.
Yeah, and also, and you can't, you know, blame that wholly on national. I mean, that's been the story ever since, you know, 1990 or something like that.
Sure.
But that is the sort of thing that parties will be trying to tap into, that perception.
Now, so you've talked about inequality becoming a more politicised issue, and I think it's amazing that we haven't really had this on the agenda for generations. Why is it suddenly a big issue in the world and New Zealand, do you think?
Well, I think the global financial crisis was a bit of a wake-up call because what it shattered was a lot of the things that had kind of justified a big increase in inequality. So the idea that this system was working really well and was stable and all the rest of it was a big underlying argument for let's not rock the boat.
Right.
The other thing is I think people have just finally realised that trickle-down stuff doesn't happen. I mean, and you can have a political view about that thing, but the evidence, and we talk about this a lot in the book, is that incomes,
the book.
There we go,
Yep.
bit of a plug.
Yeah, a plug for the book.
Yeah,
it is a really good book.
The evidence is over the last 30 years, if you've had income doubling for people at the top, but they've really barely increased or increased very slightly for people at the bottom. And it takes a long time for that evidence to become clear, but once you look at it, you can look at it now for the last 30 years, and you can see, well, there just hasn't been trickle down.
Right. So the actual consensus or the strong ideological, paradigms of the day are being challenged or eroded. Is that what you're saying? That?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and people are returning to that basic question about, how is income shared out under the current system? I mean, it's something you always confront as a society, but it's more urgent now.
What about some of the things like the Occupy movement? Because, at the start of the global financial crisis, they kind of really politicised this idea of the 1% versus the 99%, which strikes me as having been, from a kind of communications or propaganda focus, has been incredibly successful. Is that part of the inequality debate, do you think?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, Occupy itself, you'd have to question what it produced in any tangible sense. But yeah, I mean, we are the 99% is a brilliant bit of sloganeering, right? And what it does, the useful thing that's lying underneath that is, when I started out working on the book, I thought this was a story about, say, the top and the bottom moving apart. But what I realised is that actually you've got the top doing well, but actually people in the middle and the bottom doing extremely poorly. So it is a kind of, the rich and the rest sort of story rather than just being a top versus bottom.
Okay. So on Twitter, we're encouraging political parties and other politicians, candidates to post your reaction on Twitter, use the hashtag, VoteChat14. And I think we've got a question from the Expat Party.
We do indeed, Bryce. Yes, the Expat Party has asked about the number of Kiwis actually returning to New Zealand because the grass isn't actually always greener on the other side. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you see a certain amount of that, but we've seen really, really high outflows of people in recent years, and that's a big concern. That's a big brain drain, and I think a lot of what that stems from is the perception of a lack of opportunity in New Zealand, and tackling that is definitely a big part of the inequality debate.
Okay, let's get back to some of the policy prescriptions that might impact on inequality in this election year. What about capital gains tax? That's one of Labour's big, policies that is quite unique in this election year. How would that impact inequality? Because I haven't quite worked that out.
Well, firstly, you'd have to say that's something that the Greens have been advocating as well.
Okay.
So there's a bit of a consensus across those parties about the need for a capital gains tax. Well, the thing is, what it would do is it would mean that people who are getting their income from selling assets, selling houses and so on and so forth, were actually paying tax on that, whereas they generally don't at the moment. And those people are disproportionately in the top 10%, I think. It's pretty clear. And so you would be, reducing the disposable income of the people in that tax bracket, and you would then presumably use that to do something to lift income.
But not necessarily. It's just, I see what your point is about. It reduces inequality by reducing the incomes of the rich.
Yeah.
But it could be used by governments for anything, couldn't it? Is it really going to have that bigger impact on inequality? Is I guess what I'm wondering, especially when you look at the possible other unintended impacts, because some people argue that it would lead to much higher housing rentals, for example, because less people would be supplying rental properties. So wouldn't it possibly make things worse?
I think it's got the potential to have some of those impacts, but there's things you can do to cushion that. housing affordability, housing generally is a massive issue to do with inequality, that increasing divide between people who own and people who don't, and the quality of housing they can own. So you'd need to offset it. So you might need to have, a program of building more houses. And both the parties that advocate for a capital gains tax have those policies in different forms.
Yeah.
So you're dealing with that. And ultimately, any revenue raising measure, well, governments can use it however they like.
Okay.
But if they believe in having a capital gains tax, which is about saying, there's a basic fairness issue that some income isn't taxed, you assume that they're going to use it for redistributive purposes.
Just one final question about that capital gains tax. Why exempt the family home?
Well,
that seems to undercut the whole purpose of it.
I think that stems from, there's obviously a political calculation there that people don't want to be taxed on selling.
So it's a pragmatic part of introducing a capital gains tax?
Well, I think it's probably partly pragmatic, but there is also a philosophical point there that, having a home is, the basic act of having a home is a necessity. It's an essential part of human existence. It's not an investment. You're not really doing it to generate income. So at least below a certain level, you can justify, but you could do what they do in the US, for example, whereby they do tax sales of the family home, but only if it's above a certain value.
Well, that makes a lot more sense, doesn't it, from an equality point of view? I mean, it seems that the Green Labour policy on capital gains tax is allowing rich homeowners to get away scot-free.
It would to an extent, but you'd be taxing all the other homes that people own, and the really massive inequality is around people who own multiple properties and are generating income from selling those. So you'd be capturing those.
Won't there be lots of loopholes on that? Everyone in the family owns the home, each home,
Yeah. But there are potential loopholes in any policy, and you have virtually every developed country other than us has a capital gains tax of some kind, and they generate a lot of money out of them. So they've obviously solved those problems.
Right.
And you just have to be vigilant about how people are trying to fix the things and, and tackle that.
Well, let's talk about the Greens. As you said before, they're the party that most pushed the issue of inequality in the last election. So are they the party that are most effective on inequality, do you think?
Well, that's an interesting question. As a bit of disclosure, I should say that I'm doing a short research contract for the Greens at the moment, kind of providing information about what are the options for tackling inequality, what are the strengths and weaknesses, those kinds of things. So ironically, I probably shouldn't comment about the Greens.
So does this mean you're a Green supporter?
No, not necessarily.
Everyone has to eat and have jobs, so I get that. So does this mean, though, if after the show the National Party ring up and say, hey, Max, we'd like to recruit you to do some income inequality research, would you do that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. It's like contracting work, basically. So I'm not, a member of the Green Party, and I'm not there, and I don't stand up and advocate and say people should vote Green or even that people should support particular policies. I'd contract to anyone if National, give me a ring, I'll pick up the phone. Yeah,
but isn't the danger that you kind of get co-opted, and here we have New Zealand's expert on inequality sort of, I don't know, you're not being silenced, you're here today talking about it, but aren't they buying you?
No, I think these are just things that you have to negotiate. You have to be open about it, as I always am. And it's only a short-term thing. It's a short research contract. If I derived all my income from working for the Greens, then absolutely, there would be a massive. I would no longer be independent at that point.
Right.
But I work with business groups. I've done lots of talks to various business forums. I'm working on a debate proposal with a whole bunch of economists. So I do work kind of right across the spectrum.
Okay, well, I don't know if you can tell us about this then, but so what are you doing for the Greens? What stuff are they interested in at the moment in terms of inequality?
Well,
I know you're not a spokesperson for them.
I probably can't say too much actually, but it is just looking at, if you want policies to reduce income inequality, well, firstly, what are the drivers? What things are causing it? Because you need to know what the problem is before you know what the solution is. What are the drivers? What are the options for addressing those drivers? What are the strengths and weaknesses of those options? How would you shape that up?
Okay. So what, again, I guess from your more objective or analysis, what are the main things the Greens are doing in terms of inequality? What are they proposing?
Well, obviously I can't talk too much about what they might or might not be proposing in future. But, you rewind to the last election, they had a policy proposal called Mind the Gap. So it was explicitly aimed at reducing inequality. And they were talking about, I mean, some of the stuff we've already discussed, like a capital gains tax, building 6,000 new state houses,
Right.
which make a big difference to wealth inequality and the conditions of people living at the
Is
bottom.
6,000 enough? It seems quite tiny to me.
That's 2,000 a year over the lifetime of a parliament, and
But
you've got.
in the context of our huge housing problem, don't we need sort of 60,000 homes?
Yeah, I mean, and their Labour have got a policy of building 100,000 homes over the next 10 years.
Okay.
The issue, though, is, I mean, you're talking about. I mean, one of the things.
Not state houses, though, are they? The
No, very different. I should be clear.
Yeah.
The Greens are talking about 6,000 state houses. Labour are talking about 100,000 affordable houses, whatever that means exactly.
Be 500,000, but whatever. Yep.
But yeah, it's not. You can't get up to scale straight. I mean, we have a house building industry in which we have very few house builders who actually build more than 100 homes a year. It would be pretty crazy to try to instantly build, X number of 100,000 homes. There just isn't the capacity.
Right. Okay. So do you think your research is going to have an impact on what the Greens are putting forward in terms of inequality?
Well, I think the research, I mean, in terms of the book and generally in that whole project, I mean, I think that's had an effect more widely. And I think, and it's not just me. I mean, it's nice to be here and talking about it, but actually, the thing about the book is we drew on all these people who've done huge amounts of research. There are a lot of people who actually do amazing work on inequality, and what we've done is just bring it into the public.
Actually, just a quick question. We should go to Twitter because you've said lots of interesting things. We'll see if there's a Twitter reaction. But who do you see as the really important commentators or experts on inequality apart from yourself?
Well, I'm reluctant to single people out,
enough.
I think. But obviously, I've a huge respect for everybody who's in the book.
But what chapters have resonated? Have you got good feedback on from the book?
One of the ones that really resonates with people is Robert Wade's chapter, and he's a New Zealander, but he's based at the London School of Economics, and he wrote the chapter about where this all fits in the global context, and he takes a great sweep across the top 1% across the whole of the world, and the kind of the power that they exert and how all those mechanisms work and how parties have tried to respond to that or not respond to that. And that's a really powerful example of.
Okay, let's go to Liam and see if there's any Twitter questions or responses.
Yeah, there's been lots of good banter flying around on Twitter lately. John Brinsley Perry asked in regards to your obviously involvement in inequality policies, what would you say has been the most harmful policy towards inequality that's happened in New Zealand?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, when New Zealand's inequality really rose sharply was in the late 80s and early 90s. And probably one of the things, I mean, and this is a very political issue, but one of the things that had a really, really marked impact on increasing poverty at that lower end was in 1991 when benefits were cut by up to 25% of their value. And whatever the justifications for that are or aren't, that's something that's had an enormous impact.
So why don't we reverse that? I mean, are any of the parties talking about reversing those benefit cuts?
No, not directly.
So, I mean, can't you say therefore that the parties that are talking about inequality the most, Greens and Labour, kind of agree with Ruth Richardson's benefit cuts? Because they're not reversing them.
I very much doubt that they agree with them, but I don't think
they're not wanting to change them.
Well, I don't think they think it's politically feasible to try to do that. You look at public opinion polling, support for increased payments to beneficiaries is not very high at all and hasn't been for a long time.
But if parties really believed about inequality, wouldn't they be trying to change people's opinions on this?
Well, look, you're a political scientist, Bryce, you'd know better than me. Parties are always operating in that space between what they want to do and what they think is actually feasible.
Yeah.
So I think there's calculated judgment about that.
Okay, just from your own point of view then, regardless of the parties, benefit payments, are they high enough?
I think there is good evidence to suggest that they should be higher, actually. I mean, even if you just look at it in really technical terms, the poverty level is set at, you're in poverty if you've got less than 60% of the average income, basically. Well, benefits are well below that. So by definition, most people on benefits are in poverty. A lot of people on benefits are in poverty. So yeah, I mean, even just on a technical basis, there's an argument for increasing benefit payments.
What about, there's various arguments about universal basic income, or Gareth Morgan's argument about giving everyone a benefit, if you like. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, that's and it's an idea we canvass in the book. The idea of an unconditional basic income is that everybody, as of right, should get a payment of, say, $10,000 or $11,000 a year, because that's just a basic human entitlement, and it's not means tested. And you do that instead of the whole complex system of means tested benefits. The advantage of it is obviously it delivers a guarantee of income to everybody, and it's more efficient, and people can work on top of it and not lose it.
Is it a left-wing policy? That's what I can never quite work out.
No, it's one of those policies that attracts support from across the spectrum. Guy Standing, who's a big advocate of it, was in town recently, and he said that Milton Friedman, who most people would probably regard as being a right-leaning economist, somewhat, had supported it from the point of view that even if what you really value is enterprise and hard work, you actually need to give people a basic level of security, basic cushion off which they can be entrepreneurial. Okay, so you would advocate this? Not necessarily. I think I don't personally advocate any particular solutions, or I try not to. I think, you can really clearly see the advantages. The question mark that it always comes up against, and this is why the Treasury has kind of not been that interested in it, is basically the cost. Because even at $10,000 or $11,000 per person a year, it's relatively expensive, and actually that would leave a lot of people who are on benefits at the moment worse off. Oh, okay. So someone who's on incapacity benefit, or what was called incapacity benefit, would be worse off. People on what was called the DPB would be worse off. Okay. So if you're going to raise it to those levels, then it would become extremely expensive, and if you don't, you're actually leaving some people worse off. So there are a lot of really complicated questions about that. Now, just going back to this question of to what extent inequality is resonating with the public, there was a Colmar Brunton poll out a couple of weeks ago that showed the top, I think, 5 issues for the public. Inequality wasn't there. Is it dipping down? Is it disappearing now, do you think? Well, the thing about polling is it does depend a lot on how you ask the question. Sure. I mean, that poll was really interesting, but nowhere in the top 5 issues was the economy. Yeah. Now, in every other poll you see the economy is always up there, so you have to be a bit careful about reading too much into that poll. I tend to talk a lot about, there was a Roy Morgan poll where they've asked people the same question, what's the number 1 issue in New Zealand, consistently for the last few years. Yeah. And their question is, the issue is poverty/inequality. And that has gone from really being nowhere a few years ago to being the number 1 issue for New Zealanders. Right. I mean, that's wrapping the two things together. Sure. So, there's a bit of, basically what I really think is, I think for some people, for a big chunk of the population, inequality does matter, but that's only part of the population. For a lot of people, they care about the issues tied to inequality, but the word itself doesn't mean a lot to them. That's interesting, actually. So in that Colmar Brunton poll, I think it was 14% said it was inequality was important. So what other issue, sort of terminology or language do we use? Do we use poverty or? That's still the lens through which people view it. And so in that poll, in the top 5, certainly for some groups, were both wages. Yep. Well, actually, and jobs as well, and child poverty. And particularly the level of wages and child poverty, those are both absolutely inequality issues. They're core inequality issues, but people just wouldn't necessarily use that word to describe them. It's a pretty good word, though, isn't it, to use? But I sort of sometimes wonder if it's a bit academic and a bit sort of abstract. Yeah, I think it's, in terms of what we're doing, and in terms of what you're doing, trying to present, the evidence really carefully and well. Yeah, inequality is the issue, it's the thing, but if you're trying to connect with a broader audience, you probably will talk more about poverty or, wages falling behind costs or, any one of those things, standard of living. Some people just talk about fairness. Actually, politicians often use the fairness one. Yeah. And that's basically a code word for inequality. Okay. We've talked about the Greens, Labour, National. What about the other parties? Do you see anything that they are saying in particular of any interest in terms of inequality? The Mana Party, the Murray Party, New Zealand First? Yeah, with the Mana Party, people laugh. That's an interesting one. Well, just
to the ACT Party, people seem to laugh at that as if the ACT Party couldn't be interested in inequality. Is it possible for someone that really cares about inequality to vote ACT, or is that inconsistent?
That's pretty tricky, because I think supporters of ACT would probably argue that any inequality that's delivered is just the fair result of the workings of the marketplace and is down to individual effort or lack thereof.
Okay.
So I haven't actually seen ACT say anything specifically about inequality, but I would guess
they have in the past.
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty comfortable with it, I think, is the fundamental point. I mean, they certainly wouldn't support widespread government intervention to do anything to correct it. No,
but they might argue that the welfare states produced worsened inequality by making people dependent on benefits, etc. So regardless of whether we agree or not, they seem to be concerned with inequality.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that you would have, that you've seen a detailed suite of policies or anything from them on it recently. But I mean, it's certainly not impossible, that parties of the centre-right can be concerned about income inequality. I mean, you go back in time and it was a different framework, but the inequality fell consistently over the 12 years of the Holyoake government, for example, and that was a national-led government. The share of income going to the 1% fell throughout that time.
Exactly.
So, it is something that can be cross-party.
In fact, don't we have to be wary, though, of parties that just talk about inequality all the time? It doesn't necessarily mean they have an answer, or, it could be lip service, couldn't it? I mean, back in the last British general election, it was the Conservative Party that was most going on about inequality, and they were complaining about inequality having got worse under the British Labour government, and they got votes on the basis of that. So, which kind of, in retrospect, after seeing what they've done in government, looks a bit like lip service.
Yeah, well, but I mean, that's true of politics, always, isn't it? I mean, you can talk about something, but the real test is, what are your policies and what are they going to do about it? And that's why, when people ask, well, who's going to have the best policies, who should you vote from? That's why I say, well, you've got to wait, and we've got 6 months of election campaign to come. Okay,
but what about national then? Could someone that's really concerned about inequality vote national? I mean, is there consistency there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do have that issue that sometimes, people on that side of the spectrum talk much more about the mobility stuff and don't always address, the actual absolute income gaps. But, those things to promote mobility do have an effect over time. They're absolutely part of the story. And I think there is, you absolutely can be a National Party member or supporter and be concerned about inequality. You just have a different prescription.
Right.
And you're probably more inclined to see the solutions in terms of, doing more to support opportunity and freeing up people to earn, rather than, the tax and benefit side of things. Okay,
what's happening on Twitter, Liam?
Yeah, there's lots of interesting reactions to this conversation. One question I think people would really like to know and get an answer to is, does Colin Craig believe in inequality? Do you think he would could anyone vote for him if they're really concerned about inequality?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it would be harder to answer than anything else, because Colin Craig isn't a guy whose views fit neatly anywhere across the political spectrum. I mean, he supports some things that are quite consistent with a national-led government, but at the same time, isn't that respectful for private property rights and a whole lot of other things. So, what the Conservatives would do on inequality, to be honest, I really don't know, but I hope people will be asking them.
Yep. Interestingly, there's another question regarding the living wage campaign. Obviously, they've been fairly vocal and active on inequality and trying to fix that problem in New Zealand. What do you make of the living wage campaign?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting campaign, and what it's talking about is saying, sometimes when we think about inequality, we go straight to the stuff around tax and benefits. How does the government close up the gap? But actually, inequality is created in the first instance in the marketplace, in the different wages and salaries and other income that people earn. And there's probably a lot, particularly from an efficiency point of view, rather than taxing people and then paying it back to them through working for families, there's a good argument to actually try to narrow the gaps in the marketplace. And one of the ways you would do that is to raise incomes at the bottom. And a living wage, where you're arguing that people should be paid $18.80 an hour rather than $14.25, would absolutely be a way to address that for some
So
low-income earners.
you've brought up working for families, and I wanted to ask you about that. To what extent has that fixed inequality? I mean, there's some people on both the left and right that say that that's some sort of subsidy for business, essentially, and that really we just need higher wages. What's your feeling on that?
Well, both views are true to an extent. I mean, inequality in New Zealand shot up in the late 80s and through the 90s, as I've said, and reached a peak in the early 2000s. Now, the principal reason that it fell a little bit under Labour is working for families. And there's no doubt about that.
So you're talking just a little bit. I mean, it's a hugely expensive policy. If we're really concerned about inequality, shouldn't we be focused on wages?
Yeah, well, that's the other part of that argument. I mean, is that working for families is basically a policy that says we're not really going to challenge too much the inequality that the marketplace delivers. We'll just narrow the gap and soften the impact, particularly for low and middle income families. Whereas what a lot of the attention is shifting to now is, as I said, is actually how do you narrow that gap to begin with?
Right.
And what you would have if you had a living wage paid extensively across the economy is you would have shifted the burden of ensuring that people actually have enough to sort of get by and participate on. You'd shift that burden from the government and back onto employers, which, you can have a moral argument about whether that's the right thing or not, but that would be the effect of it. And then you'd have quite significant savings in working for families, which you could then use to do other forms of support.
We've got lots of students here from Otago boys, in fact, who I guess are 16, 17, 18. So the living wage would say that they should get paid, $18.40 an hour. I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Because, I mean, whoever you are, if you're doing the work, there's an argument that you deserve to be well paid for it, no matter if you're competent to do it, then you should get paid as much as anyone else. I mean, that is one of the issues that is raised about the living wage, is that a lot of people who are poorly paid are not actually families, they are individuals.
Yeah, because that's the issue, isn't it? Because a student from Otago boys doesn't have the same costs as a solo mother with 3 kids. And why should they be paid the same?
Well, I think you've got to separate out the two issues. They may not have the same costs, but the responsibility for dealing with those costs is not solely on the employer. So, the living wage is arguing you need a higher basic floor, and then if people have extra expenses on top of that, if they have a bigger family, well, they still need working for families payments to make sure that their income, their disposable income, is at the same level as people who don't have as many kids.
Okay. You've talked a bit about some of the big changes in the levels of inequalities that's happening in the late 80s and early 90s. And if you look at the graphs, which you do all the time, it's a huge jump then. So, when we're arguing about the last 10 years, it's kind of a fluctuating level of inequality. But the huge jump was then. So you relate that, I presume, to various public policy changes of the time. I mean, what could have been done different?
Well, probably the alternative that was there would have been to choose, because we had an incredibly protected economy at the time, right? And we went for a very completely open economy without really thinking through the transition particularly well. So, the alternative would have been, probably the path that's followed, has been followed by, say, the Scandinavian countries, which are open and dynamic, but have maintained lower levels of inequality.
I'm still trying to pin you down here. So would you have New Zealand less open in a globalised sense, in a trading sense? No, not necessarily, because those, again, the Scandinavian countries, they don't hide behind tariffs or barriers or anything like that. They accept that, they welcome the fact that the modern world is open and dynamic and it's a global economy, but they adapt to that. And they, in particular, they put a lot of effort into retraining and reskilling people who are made unemployed by those sudden shifts in the economy. But any of those Rogernomics or neoliberal reforms, are there any that particularly need to be rolled back in terms of progressing the inequality agenda?
Well, part of that package we've already talked about, which was cuts to benefits. Probably one of the other things that's been a big contributor to rising inequality is the reduction in the number of people who are covered by collective bargaining of some form or another, which, all the international evidence suggests is a good way of lifting wages at the bottom and reducing inequality. So those are a couple of the big things. Probably cutting top tax rates from 66% to 33%, was another big contributor.
So would you put it back up to 66?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, there's a question of is it politically feasible versus what is actually the desirable top rate of tax. Now, on the second point, I mean, the first point is a question for political parties. On the second point, there's been quite a lot of modelling done by these the French economists, Emmanuel Sayers and Thomas Piketty, the guys who've been doing all the stuff about the top 1% and how much of income they get. The modelling they've done suggests that you would put your top tax rate to achieve maximum revenue, but without discouraging any extra effort or hard work or whatever, would vary between countries, but would be somewhere in the range of 50 to 70%.
Okay, that's very interesting. Now, let's see in the audience if there's any questions for Max. At the back, is that a question?
If you were asked what one policy do you think would actually be useful to reduce inequality in this election year, would you like to comment on that?
I probably wouldn't, actually, for a number of reasons, but mostly because I'm not sure that there is any one policy that would by itself make a huge difference. I mean, Bryce has already quite rightly pointed out that, I mean, capital gains tax is a big one, but that would only have limited effects, and actually without other policies could have some negative effects. So, although I know this sounds unhelpful, I actually think focusing on one policy would be a mistake.
Okay. Another question at the back there?
So you're a journalist, but I just want to know what you think of the way that poverty's been dealt with by the media. Do New Zealanders see what really is going on out there via the eyes of the media? Are they doing a good job?
That's an interesting question. I think people are now really aware of child poverty. They're aware of the numbers. I don't think people probably fully appreciate what it is like to be living in poverty in New Zealand, but there's only so much the media can do about that. A lot of that is down to the fact that because we now have a more divided country by income, people don't see a lot of each other's lives, for example. So I think it's people's day-to-day experience of other lives that's really lacking.
But surely there's been an increase in the reporting on poverty. I mean, you look at people like Simon Collins in the Herald. Huge, increase in the coverage of what's happening on people's day-to-day lives.
Yep. Oh, yeah, there's definitely been an increase, and John Campbell has been raising it hugely. But then those media don't reach everybody. I mean, and I don't know, for example, how much this issue gets aired on talkback radio, for example, or in what form. But I think, and the opinion polling shows that people are really, that poll Bryce talked about, child poverty was up there as a top 5 issue for most people. So it's got up there. I think the issue, though, is that a lot of people probably still would argue that if children are in poverty, it's their parents' fault, So all the reporting on child poverty, in a way, doesn't really engage with what, in a sense, is probably the ultimate debate, which is not about adults' views about children, but adults' views about other adults.
Okay, any other questions in the audience? Byron, at the back.
Hey, Max. I was just wanted to ask, you talk a lot about sort of, I guess, the fiscal policy side of things, but I was just wondering if you think that the consensus that New Zealand has on monetary policy has any sort of influence on the way inequality is sort of developed.
Yeah, I think it does, and that's something that in the book Nigel Harworth, who's an economist from Auckland University, talks about. And his argument is that you can do all these things to try to tackle inequality, but actually if your wider economic policy settings aren't right, then you're going to struggle. And I mean, Nigel's argument is that we focus very much on keeping inflation low in this country, but that's at the expense of other things, particularly of relatively high unemployment, arguably. And you would have a very different situation with inequality if you aim for full employment. Again, say more relaxed about inflation being slightly wider than the current target band. So I mean, that's a bit of a bigger picture thing, and I can't talk about it in great detail. But you're right to raise it.
Okay, let's go back to Twitter and see what's happening. Liam.
It's been a great 50 minutes or so, and lots of banter flying around, especially about your sock choice today, Bryce.
Okay.
Since it's almost election time, Max, How important is the use of language and words when we talk about inequality and those issues in the election?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I guess we've already touched on that a bit. I think inequality as a word doesn't resonate with everybody, and you have to start with where people are. I mean, you have to work with the concerns that people already have and show how what you're talking about is relevant to that. And so a lot of people are really concerned about equal opportunities, and so I spend quite a bit of time saying, yep, equal opportunities are really important, but all the evidence is that it's very hard to get equal opportunities without more equal incomes. I mean, that's a point kind of canvassed already. And just relating it to really basic things. So talking about, well, why has your salary not kept pace with the growth of the economy in general, relating it to really everyday concerns that people have. I think that's really important.
Okay, we're just about finished, so just in the last few minutes, I just wanted to ask you whether this is all just too much tinkering. Isn't the issue so big, so massive, that talking about, capital gains tax or some small changes here or there is kind of just quite ineffectual? Like, you notice that people like Russell Brand in the UK are talking about democracies in crisis, that voting for this party or the other, if you're concerned about inequality, is not really going to do anything. Aren't there lots of policy prescriptions that are off the table that we need to bring onto the table?
Yeah, I mean, it depends within what we've been doing in the book is really, just basically raising the issue. And I mean, yeah, you could argue that if you're really going to tackle inequality, you do much more radical things, but most people aren't even at the position really of fully understanding what inequality is. So I think you've kind of got to start with where people are, right, and then try and shift them into the frame where they're thinking about the issue, before you get to anything more radical. And I don't think, again, it's that sort of picking up on one thing. Capital gains tax isn't going to change the world, but actually if you have, it is perfectly possible to put forward a really comprehensive set of things, government policies in the wider sense that would make a big difference. Okay,
but just thinking outside the box or dreaming and forgetting about what's political reality in election year, aren't there any other policies that you would push, inheritance tax or anything like that? Wouldn't they have a big impact or a bigger impact?
Yeah, absolutely. An inheritance tax is a really interesting example of something that is not really on the table at the moment.
Why isn't it? Why aren't the Greens, Labour or whoever, do they have policies on getting rid of that huge part of inequality?
Certainly not at the moment. And the thing about inheritance taxes is they have been very successfully characterised as death taxes. Right. You're being taxed for dying, which does sound pretty crazy, if you think about it like that, right? Yeah. So, you probably need other ways of thinking about that, and that might be, do you tax the recipients of inheritances, inheritances over a certain size, for example, rather than, taxing the donor, so that you're changing the whole way that works. And in just in terms of equity and fairness, there are really strong arguments for that, because inheritance are by definition unearned. Yeah. So there's a strong equity argument. So
this all brings up the idea of what is the right level of inequality. We're at this level. Yeah. Is there a correct level? We look at the Gini coefficient. It's 24, or what is it at the moment? Do you have an idea of what would be acceptable to you?
Well, it's an interesting question. There's obviously no magic answer for what is the right level, but you look at, say, again, those, hate to keep citing them, but the Scandinavian countries, sure, they have a level of inequality. Let's say roughly, someone in the top 10% earns roughly 5-6 times as much as someone at the bottom. That's where we used to be. We're now at more like someone in the top 10% earns 9 to 10 times as much as someone in the bottom 10%. And that level that Scandinavian countries have now is compatible with being in the modern economy, and we used to have it. So could
political parties or governments, they seem to like targets or figures, could they take on a target like that, or a Gini coefficient level that they would want to get to?
It would absolutely be possible. Yep. Inequality is such a complex thing, it's hard to control. Like, you'd be a bit of a hostage to fortune if we said we're definitely going to cut it back to where it was in the 80s. But there's nothing stopping parties aiming for that.
Okay.
No.
Last question that we're going to ask all the participants on Vote Chat. Yeah. What's going to happen in the election? What's your forecast?
Oh,
I know
question.
it's 6 months out, but just go with what you. How are you feeling at the moment in terms of an outcome?
Well, I would probably have to go with the conventional wisdom, and bear in mind that despite some terrible recent polls for Labour and the Greens, the rolling poll of poll averages is still pretty close. It's still National and Labour and the Greens pretty even pegging. And I personally think that will continue, and governments tend to lose support as election campaigns go on. So I would have to go with the conventional wisdom that it'll be really tight, and we'll see New Zealand First holding the balance of power. Okay, good call. Oh, well, we're going to leave it there. So thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks for watching on the live stream on the Herald website. Thanks for following on Twitter. And definitely thanks for Max for coming along. It's been a great discussion. And thanks for Liam for doing the live tweeting, and the production crew, especially James and Ashley, who made this happen today. Okay, so thanks for coming, Max. Thanks very much.